12 men walked into Harlem before sunrise. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains. Nobody called the police. Nobody needed to. Harlem, 1947. The war had been over for 2 years. The victory parades had come and gone. The ticker tape had settled somewhere downtown, far south of where the men who actually bled for that flag were trying to find work, find rent, find a reason to believe the country they'd fought for had any intention of fighting for them back. It didn't. Not up here. November. Early. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives one morning and stays. The kind of cold that makes everything slower except the people who can't afford to be slow. On 116th Street, the day started before the sun did. It always had. The woman at the corner of Lenox Avenue had her cart out by 5:30. Coffee, rolls, yesterday's newspaper folded under her arm for anyone who asked. She'd been on that corner since 1938 and had watched the neighborhood change the way rivers change slowly, then all at once. She knew every face. She knew which faces were new. That morning, she noticed 3 she didn't recognize. She didn't say anything. She just began rolling her cart south, a little earlier than usual. That was how Harlem communicated. Not with words, with movement. To understand what 116th Street was in 1947, you have to understand what it was not. It was not a neighborhood that the city of New York protected. The police came to Harlem the way a landlord comes to a property he doesn't live in to collect, to enforce, occasionally to destroy, never to serve. The precincts up here had their arrangements with certain people. And those arrangements had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with money moving in one direction without too many questions. The hospitals were understaffed. The schools were overcrowded. The buildings that weren't condemned should have been. The men who came back from the Pacific and from Europe decorated, damaged, hollowed out in ways that don't show on the body, came back to apartments with broken radiators and landlords who didn't return calls and a GI Bill that worked considerably better if your skin was a different shade. The city had decided, without ever quite saying it, that Harlem was a place to be managed, contained, taxed without investment, fed just enough to keep it from burning. It had already burned once. In 1935, this same neighborhood had erupted not from criminal impulse, not from chaos for its own sake, but from years of pressure applied to people with nowhere left to be pressed. The spark was small, the fire was not. And when the smoke cleared, nothing fundamental had changed. The same buildings, the same broken promises, the same precinct arrangements. What had changed quietly, without a press conference, was who the community turned to. Not downtown, not City Hall. Here, on 116th, on Lenox, on 7th Avenue, to the men and women who had stayed when everyone else left or looked away. The numbers game was the economy of Harlem in ways that mainstream newspapers chose not to explain accurately. It was not simply gambling. That word flattens something far more complex. The numbers were credit when the banks said no. The numbers were employment when the factories said not hiring. The numbers were a tax system that, unlike the cities, actually circulated money within the community that generated it. The runner who collected bets on a Tuesday morning knew every family on his block. He knew who was behind on rent. He knew which kid needed shoes before winter. That wasn't incidental to the job. That was the job. And the man who sat at the center of that system, not as its inventor, not as its only operator, but as its most reliable guarantor, understood this better than anyone. He had read enough to understand economics. He had lived enough to understand what economics means when it fails the people living inside it. His name was in the air that November morning, the way certain names become part of a neighborhood's weather. Not spoken loudly, not spoken carelessly, just present. But something else was in the air that morning too. The woman with the cart felt it first. Then the man outside the barber shop on 118th who'd been opening that same door at 7 a.m. since 1941. He'd unlocked it, looked down the block, and locked it again. Not because of anything he saw, because of something he didn't. The block was too quiet. Not the quiet of early morning that had its own texture, its own rhythm, the distant clatter of a city warming up, the smell of something frying 3 floors above, the sound of a radio playing through a window someone had left open overnight. This was different. This was the quiet that comes before a conversation nobody asked for. 3 faces she didn't recognize. A car idling on the corner that nobody got out of. A runner who usually had his slips organized by 6:15 who hadn't shown by 7. None of it, taken alone, meant anything. Taken together, it meant something was coming down from somewhere, headed somewhere it hadn't been invited. Harlem had felt this before. It had survived it before. But this time felt different in the way that all the times that turned out to be different had felt different, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the stomach. In the way the woman with the cart moved south, quietly, without looking back. The name of the man those 3 strangers were there to discuss hadn't come up yet. It would. It always did. But that morning, 116th Street woke up the way it always woke up, with work to do, and no time to waste on what was coming. That discipline would not last the week. Nobody introduced Bumpy Johnson. That was the first thing you noticed, if you were paying attention. In a room full of men who needed to be seen, who announced themselves with volume, with jewelry, with the particular posture of someone who has recently acquired something worth protecting, Bumpy Johnson walked in, and the room simply rearranged itself. Quietly, without instruction. The way furniture seems to shift when the light changes. You didn't applaud that. You didn't comment on it. You just found yourself standing somewhere slightly different than you'd been standing before. November 4th, 7947, 8:20 am. The back room of a restaurant on 116th Street that didn't have a name on the door. Not because it was hiding implies fear, but because the people who needed to find it already knew where it was, and the people who didn't need to find it were better served by the ambiguity. The room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, and the particular combination of damp wool and cold air that every room in Harlem carried in November. A single bulb overhead, 4 chairs, 2 of them occupied by men who stopped their conversation mid-sentence when the door opened. Not because they were told to, because it was the thing you did. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson Bumpy to everyone who knew him, which was everyone set his hat on the table, sat down, and opened the book he'd been carrying. Langston Hughes. Shakespeare in Harlem. 1942 edition. He read 3 lines before he looked up. When he did, both men realized they had been watching him read, and neither of them had noticed until he caught them doing it. "You have something for me," Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. He was 42 years old that November, born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. Arrived in Harlem as a child and never left, not by choice, anyway. The city would eventually make that choice for him, more than once, through the machinery of courts and judges and federal institutions that processed men like him with the same dispassion they processed everything else. But in 1947, he was here, present, settled into the neighborhood the way old trees settle into soil, not decoratively, but structurally. The kind of presence that, if removed, would leave a hole that took years to understand. He was not a large man. That surprised people who met him, expecting something else. Medium height, lean but not slight, the kind of physical stillness that reads differently depending on whether you're afraid of him. To people who weren't afraid of him, and there were fewer of those than you'd expect, he looked like a man waiting for a bus. To people who were afraid of him, he looked like something that had already decided what it was going to do and was simply giving you the courtesy of time. His face was difficult to read, not because he masked it deliberately, though he could, but because the expressions he used most often were ones that don't have simple names. Not anger, not warmth exactly, something closer to attention, the particular quality of a man who is listening harder than you think he is. The 2 men in the room that morning were both older than Bumpy. Both had been in Harlem longer than him. Both had their own operations, their own arrangements. their own histories of surviving situations that should have ended them. They told him what they'd seen that week. He listened without interrupting. This was notable. Men in rooms like this interrupted each other constantly, not from rudeness, but from the particular anxiety of needing to demonstrate that you already knew what was being said. Bumpy had no such anxiety. He let the information arrive at its own pace. He asked 2 questions when they finished. Specific questions. The kind that told you he'd been thinking about this longer than the conversation had been happening. When they were done, he nodded once. Then he picked up the book again. The meeting was over. There was a woman named Grace who ran a seamstress shop on 118th Street. She had known Bumpy since 1934. She was not affiliated with anything he operated. She was a seamstress. But she had watched him for 13 years from across the street through her shop window, in the way that people in close neighborhoods absorb the people who define the texture of daily life. She once told her daughter, not as a warning, not as a lesson, just as an observed fact, that Bumpy Johnson was the only man she had ever seen who made other men smaller without doing anything to them. He doesn't press them down, she said. They just find their own level when he's in the room. Her daughter asked if that frightened her. Grace thought about it for a moment. It would frighten me, she said, if I ever thought he was wrong. She paused. So far, he hasn't been. He gave to the church on 115th Street every month. Not publicly. He dropped an envelope unmarked, uncelebrated with the Reverend's assistant on the 1st of every month. If the Reverend knew who it was from, he never confirmed it from the pulpit. He just made sure the building stayed heated through winter. Bumpy had read about a study. Once he read everything that said communities survive not through the strength of their institutions, but through the reliability of their informal networks. The people who show up, the arrangements that hold without paperwork. He hadn't needed a study to know that. He had grown up inside it. The men on the corner of 116th, the ones who stood there every morning, not because they had nowhere to go, but because they were part of how information moved through the neighborhood. They had a particular tradition. When Bumpy walked past, they didn't greet him loudly. They didn't call out his name. They simply stopped whatever they were saying, mid-sentence, and resumed it after he had passed. Not from fear. From something closer to what you'd feel watching a storm move over the water from a distance. Something that commands attention, not because it asks for it, but because the alternative, looking away, feels like a failure of something important in yourself. He was back on 116th by 9:15. The book was under his arm. His hat was back on. He walked at the pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, which was the pace of a man who had already decided everything urgent. 3 men fell into step behind him, not close enough to suggest escort, close enough to suggest alignment. Nobody on the block acknowledged any of this. They didn't need to. What Bumpy knew by 9:15 that morning, the rest of Harlem would understand by the end of the week. Something had come into the neighborhood. And the neighborhood had noticed before it had. Dutch Schultz did not ask for things. That was the distinction he made about himself, privately, in the way that certain men construct a personal mythology around the one quality they believe separates them from everyone beneath them. Other men negotiated. Other men sent letters, made calls, arranged meetings in neutral locations with neutral language and the polite fiction that both parties had something to gain. Schultz arrived, and what he arrived at, he kept. November 6th, 1947, before dawn. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees overnight, the kind of cold that settles into brick and stays there, that makes the streets look harder than they are, that turns breath into something visible and brief. A black sedan crossed 110th Street at 5:47 in the morning. Then another. Then a third. They moved without urgency, which was its own kind of statement. Men in a hurry look like men who aren't certain of their welcome. These cars moved the way ownership moves, not aggressive, not cautious, simply assuming the right of passage the way water assumes the right to flow downhill. 3 cars, 12 men. They parked on separate blocks. Not together. That was deliberate. The arrangement of men who had done this before. in other neighborhoods, and had learned that 12 men standing together in one place creates a specific kind of attention. Spread across 4 blocks, they were simply men standing on corners. The kind of men you didn't look at directly. Harlem noticed anyway. To understand Dutch Schultz in 1947, you have to understand what he had already done before he looked north. Arthur Simon Flegenheimer, Dutch Schultz, was a name he gave himself, borrowed from a street fighter he'd admired in his youth, because he understood even then that certain names opened doors that others didn't. He had built his operation from the Bronx outward, through beer distribution during Prohibition, through the numbers racket in the Bronx that he had taken, not built, taken from the black operators who had constructed it from nothing. That last part was important. Schultz had not invented the numbers game. He had watched black entrepreneurs build it into something functional and profitable and community-sustaining, and then he had moved in with enough force to make the alternative to compliance too costly to consider. He had done it in the Bronx in the early 30s. He had done it in pieces of Brooklyn. He had arrangements that kept the police looking the other way, and political connections that made the legal system move slowly, when it moved at all, in his direction. He was not a stupid man. That needed to be said. He was a man who had learned that in the right environment, with the right preparation, force didn't need to announce itself. The reputation of force was sufficient. The memory of what happened to the last man who said no was sufficient. He had never been told no in a way that held. That was the problem. Not his ruthlessness, his success. He had won too many times in the same way, and winning the same way too many times makes a man believe the way he wins is the only way there is. The 12 men he sent to Harlem were not amateurs. Schultz did not send amateurs anywhere, not because he was principled about it, but because amateurs created problems that required attention, and Schultz had enough problems requiring attention without manufacturing new ones. These were men with specific skills and specific instructions. They were not there to break things. Not yet. They were there to begin the conversation that Schultz had already decided the ending of. By 8 a.m., 2 of them were inside a barber shop on 117th Street, not as customers, as presences. They sat in the waiting chairs and looked at the room and didn't speak to anyone, and the barber understood what this was and continued cutting hair because the alternative was to acknowledge it, and acknowledgement was its own kind of commitment that he wasn't ready to make at 8 in the morning. 2 more were on the corner of Lenox and 116th, standing, not doing anything that could be described as threatening in the language that courts understand, just standing, watching the runners make their morning rounds. Taking note, the woman with the coffee cart wasn't there that morning. She had moved her cart south on the 4th, and she didn't come back to that corner for 11 days. She knew what corners looked like before they became something else. The instructions the 12 men were carrying were specific enough to suggest someone had been watching Harlem longer than Harlem had been watching them. They knew the names of the primary runners. They knew the collection points. They knew which blocks operated independently and which blocks were connected to the larger apparatus that moved through the neighborhood like a circulatory system invisible to outsiders, essential to the body that depended on it. That level of preparation was not accidental. Someone had talked, not necessarily out of betrayal. Sometimes people talk to men like Schultz because the alternative is presented clearly enough that talking becomes a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. It didn't matter who. What mattered was the information existed and was now walking around Harlem in 12 pairs of shoes. By 10 a.m., the first runner had been stopped, not roughed up, not threatened, stopped. A hand on the arm, gentle enough to be deniable, firm enough to be understood. A number written on a piece of paper, a percentage, a date by which the first payment was expected. The runner looked at the piece of paper and looked at the 2 men and put the paper in his pocket and kept walking. He went directly to the restaurant on 116th with no name on the door. He didn't knock. He just stood outside. Within 4 minutes, a man came out, listened to him for 30 seconds, and went back inside. On the corner of 118th and 7th, one of Schultz's men did something that wasn't in the instructions. It was small, the kind of thing that, in a different neighborhood with different history, might have been overlooked or absorbed or filed away as the cost of a difficult morning. He took a numbers slip from an elderly man named Roosevelt. Everyone called him that. Had for 30 years. He was 71 years old and had been running his small book since before some of these buildings were standing, and he tore it, not for information, not as intimidation, with a purpose. He tore it the way you tear something when you want the person holding it to understand that what they're holding is only intact when you decide it is. Roosevelt stood very still. The man dropped the pieces and walked back to his corner. Roosevelt bent down, slowly, and picked up every piece. All of them. He put them in his coat pocket. He straightened up. He looked at the corner where the man had returned to standing. Then he walked south. He didn't go to the restaurant on 116th. He went to the church on 115th. He sat in the third pew from the back, which was where he always sat, and he stayed there for 20 minutes. When he left, he walked north, back to his corner, and resumed his morning as if nothing had happened. But on his way past the restaurant on 116th, he paused for exactly 3 seconds. He didn't look at the door. He didn't have to. By noon, Bumpy Johnson had heard from 6 different people. He had not gone looking for the information. The information had come to him, the way all important information in Harlem came to him, through the organic current of people who trusted that he needed to know, and that knowing would produce something. He sat with each person separately. He listened completely. He asked almost nothing. What he was assembling was not just a picture of what Schultz's men were doing. He was assembling a picture of how they were doing it. The preparation, the specific knowledge they'd arrived with, the precision of the operation. That precision told him things about Schultz's intentions that the actions themselves couldn't. This was not a raid. This was not a message. This was an installation. Schultz was not sending a warning. He was beginning a process that, in his experience, ended with him owning what he had arrived to take. He had done it before. He had done it so many times that he had stopped thinking of it as conquest and started thinking of it as administration. That was the insult. Not the 12 men on the corners. Not the torn numbers slip. Not the percentage written on a piece of paper. The assumption that Harlem was a place that could be administered. From downtown, by someone who had never spent a night above 110th Street in his life. Bumpy closed the book he'd been reading when the last person left. He looked at the single bulb overhead for a moment. Then he looked at the 2 men who had remained in the room not because he'd asked them to, but because they knew. He didn't tell them what he was thinking. They weren't there to hear his thinking. They were there because when this moved from the information phase to the decision phase, they needed to have been present from the beginning. He stood, put on his coat, set his hat at the precise angle he always set it. "Go home," he said. "Both of you." They looked at each other. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll need it." He walked out into the cold. 116th Street received him the way it always did, without ceremony, without distance. Like weather, Dutch Schultz had sent 12 men into Harlem. He had done it before dawn, quietly, with preparation and precision, in the way of a man who had never been told no, in a way that held. What he had not done, what he could not have known to do, was ask anyone who actually knew Harlem what the neighborhood did with men like that. The answer was already being assembled, 1 block at a time. Before you judge what happened next, you have to understand what came before, not as excuse, not as explanation, as context. Because what Dutch Schultz walked into in November of 1947 was not simply a neighborhood with a powerful man at its center. It was a neighborhood that had been pressure tested by forces larger than any one man, and had found, through necessity, through loss, through the particular ingenuity of people who had no other option, a way to hold itself together when everything institutional had failed it. Harlem had not arrived at 1,947 gently. Go back far enough, and you find the promise. The 1920s. The Harlem Renaissance. A period that gets romanticized now in ways that flatten what it actually was. Not a celebration, but an assertion. Black writers, black musicians, black artists, black intellectuals producing work of such undeniable quality that the wider culture had to at least acknowledge it existed, even if it wasn't ready to fully reckon with what acknowledgement required. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington playing the Cotton Club for audiences that were almost exclusively white, while the neighborhood that housed the Cotton Club remained almost entirely black. The arrangement said everything about the era that the era wasn't ready to say about itself. The promise of the Harlem Renaissance was not that racism was ending. It was that something was being built here that couldn't be unmade. That part turned out to be true, though it cost more than anyone advertised. Then the Depression arrived, then 1930. Then the years that followed in a succession of contracting options and expanding desperation that hit Harlem harder than almost anywhere in New York because Harlem had less margin to absorb it. The men who lost jobs downtown lost jobs. The men in Harlem who lost jobs and found that the emergency systems, the relief programs, the networks of institutional support that existed for working-class white communities in the boroughs, those systems had gaps in them that were not accidental. The gaps were shaped exactly like black families. By 1932, unemployment in Harlem was running at rates that would have been considered a national emergency if they had been occurring in a neighborhood the newspapers covered with sympathy rather than suspicion. The numbers game, the informal economy that Schultz was now attempting to absorb, was not a luxury that emerged during prosperity. It was infrastructure that emerged during collapse. It was the thing that worked when nothing else did. March 19th, 1935. A 16-year-old boy named Lino Rivera was caught shoplifting a penknife from a store on 125th Street. He was detained in the back of the store. A crowd gathered outside. A rumor moved through the crowd, the kind of rumor that moves through a community that has sufficient reason to believe the worst, that the boy had been beaten, that he was dead. He wasn't. He had been released through a back entrance. He was home by evening. But the rumor had already done what rumors do in communities, where the gap between what authorities say and what communities have witnessed with their own eyes is wide enough to make the rumor more plausible than the official account. By nightfall, 125th Street was burning. 3 people were killed. More than 100 were injured. Stores were destroyed. Property damage ran into numbers the newspapers reported with more grief than they'd ever expressed about the conditions that had produced the night. The Harlem riot of 1935 is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as an event of destruction. What it actually was a document. A community writing in the only language it had been left with, the language of the body in the street, of glass breaking, of fire, a letter to a city that had stopped reading its mail. The letter said, "We are here. We have been here. We are at the end of something." The city received the letter and commissioned a report. The report was completed. Mayor LaGuardia ordered it suppressed. It was not released publicly until 1969. By then, the neighborhood had written 3 more letters in the same language. The men who came back from the Second World War came back to all of this. They came back decorated, some of them. The 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, had a history going back to the First World War, a record of service and sacrifice that was documented and acknowledged, and then filed somewhere where it wouldn't interfere with the business of treating the men who had compiled that record as second-class citizens upon their return. You fought for a country. The country thanked you. Then the country went back to its previous arrangements regarding what you were worth and where you were permitted to live and which loans you qualified for and which neighborhoods the banks would finance and which ones they had decided, in rooms you were not invited into, to let decay. The GI Bill of 1944 is taught in American history classes as one of the great democratic achievements of the 20th century. It created the modern American middle class. What the textbooks manage less thoroughly is who that middle class was allowed to include. The Veterans Administration, in practice, in procedure, in the quiet architecture of its approvals and denials, produced outcomes that sent white veterans to new suburban homes with federally backed mortgages and sent black veterans back to Harlem with paperwork that went nowhere and a government check that covered less than the cost of the dreams it was supposed to enable. They came back to 116th Street. They came back to the numbers runners and the barbershops and the informal economy and the unwritten rules and the man on 116th whose name you didn't say too loud. Not because they had no other options, because this was home. And home, for all its damage, was the only thing that had ever actually held them. This is what Dutch Schultz was attempting to tax. Not a criminal enterprise operating in a vacuum. Not an illegal network that existed in opposition to legitimate society. A community's immune system. The numbers runners were not just moving money. They were the connective tissue of a neighborhood that the city had decided not to connect. The men who operated the books knew which families were struggling. They extended credit. They absorbed losses. They kept the information about who owed what in their heads, not in ledgers, because ledgers could be subpoenaed and heads could be trusted. When Schultz's man tore Roosevelt's numbers slip on the corner of 118th and 7th, he didn't tear a piece of paper. He tore something that had taken 15 years, and a depression, and a riot, and a war, and 100,000 quiet daily acts of survival to build. He tore it like it was nothing. That was the part Harlem couldn't absorb. Not the threat. The casualness of it. Bumpy Johnson understood all of this, not as history, but as present tense. He was not a man who spoke often about the past, not because he'd forgotten it, but because he lived in it the way you live in a house you've occupied for decades. You don't describe it to yourself. You just know where everything is. You know which floorboards creak. You know what the building sounds like before a storm. He had been 19 years old during the Harlem Renaissance and had watched the promise of it get complicated by the economics of who actually controlled the spaces where black art was celebrated. He had been 24 when the Depression arrived and had understood immediately, with the clarity of a man who has no cushion between himself and consequence, that the official systems were not going to hold. He had been 30 during the 1935 riots and had walked those streets not to participate, not to perform calm, but because the neighborhood was burning, and he lived in it, and leaving felt like a betrayal of something he couldn't name precisely, but couldn't ignore. He had spent years inside federal institutions and had come back each time to the same streets, and the streets had received him the same way, not with celebration, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a community that understood the difference between a man who was gone and a man who was absent. He was never gone. So when the information came to him on November 6th, 6 separate people, 6 separate pieces of the same picture, what he was assembling was not just tactical intelligence about 12 men on corners. He was reading the situation through everything that had come before it. He knew what happened to communities when they allowed the thing that held them together to be taken. He had watched it happen in the Bronx. He had watched the numbers operators there, men who had built something real, something functional, something that worked, absorb Schultz's arrival because they calculated that resistance was too costly, and had watched the community they'd served begin to hollow out afterward, slowly, the way a body hollows when something essential stops circulating. He was not going to watch that happen here. Not on 116th. Not in the neighborhood that had survived everything that had been pointed at it. Not while he was standing in it. The history didn't make the decision for him. It just made the decision feel like the only one available. That was the weight of it. Not anger. Responsibility. By the third day, it had a rhythm. That was the thing about Schultz's operation that separated it from the crude interventions Harlem had absorbed before. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't improvised. It arrived with the particular discipline of something that had been done before, refined through repetition, stripped of everything unnecessary. It had a rhythm. And rhythms, Bumpy knew, were harder to resist than violence. Violence creates a moment. A moment can be responded to, absorbed, survived. A rhythm creates a condition. And conditions, if left uninterrupted, become the new definition of normal. Schultz understood that, which made him more dangerous than the 12 men he'd sent to prove it. November 8th, 1947. 7 sampai 5 sais. The morning started the same way the previous two had started. The cars arrived before the sun, the same blocks, the same corners, the same men, or men indistinguishable from them, taking up the same positions with the same practiced casualness that announced, without stating, that they had been here yesterday and the day before and intended to be here tomorrow. The numbers runners adjusted their routes, not dramatically, not in ways that looked like retreat. Retreat in a neighborhood like this carried its own cost, its own message, its own permission for the thing retreating from to move further forward. They adjusted the way water adjusts around stone, finding the path of least friction, maintaining forward motion, losing ground by degrees so small that each individual degree could be rationalized. By the end of the first week, those degrees would add up to something that couldn't be rationalized. Everyone knew it. Nobody said it. The collection began formally on November 8th. Two of Schultz's men, the taller one who worked the east side of Lenox, and the one with the gray coat who had said almost nothing in 3 days, but whose silence had its own particular weight, began approaching the runners directly. Not roughly. That was the discipline of it. There was no roughness. There was instead a quality of inevitability, the way a man approaches you when he has already decided the outcome and is simply narrating the steps between his decision and your compliance. The number was 20%. 20% of the weekly take delivered to a location that would be specified on a schedule that would be determined to men who would make themselves available for the purpose. One runner, a young man named Curtis, 23 years old, quick with numbers the way some people are quick with music, asked what happened if someone declined. The man in the gray coat looked at him for a moment. "Nobody's declined yet," he said. He said it without menace, without drama. That was the answer. Bumpy's circle came to him in pieces throughout that day. First was Marcus, who ran the East Block and whose relationship with Bumpy went back 11 years to a situation involving a landlord and a family of 6 that the courts had decided not to help. Marcus was not a man who frightened easily. He had absorbed too much to have much fear left in the conventional sense. But he came into the back room of the restaurant on 116th with something in his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was the expression of a man being asked to choose between 2 costs he couldn't afford. He sat down. He explained the morning. He put the piece of paper with the 20% on the table between them. Bumpy looked at it. He didn't touch it. "How many got one of these?" he asked. "7 that I know of." "How many paid?" Marcus looked at the table. 2. Bumpy nodded, not with judgment, with the particular nod of a man filing information in a place he'll need it later. "Go home," he said. "Bumpy, go home, Marcus." Marcus went home. Then came DeWitt, who handled the books on the west side and whose operation was smaller, but whose relationships ran deeper into the fabric of the neighborhood, the churches, the school administrators, the small business owners who participated in the numbers, not as gamblers, but as members of a community that operated, in part, through this specific circulation of money. DeWitt was 51 years old. He had survived things that would have simplified a younger man into pure reaction. He came in without sitting down, which meant he had already decided what he was going to say and was concerned that sitting might soften it. "We need to move," he said. "Tonight, before they get organized." Bumpy looked at him. "Sit down, DeWitt." "Bumpy, every day we wait. Sit down." DeWitt sat. "Tell me what you saw," Bumpy said. "Not what you think, what you saw." DeWitt told him all of it. The morning, the collections, the runners who had paid, the ones who hadn't, the specific corners, the specific men, the specific quality of the operation that DeWitt, who had seen operations before, described as professional in a way that carried more unease than any amount of overt aggression would have. Bumpy listened to all of it without interrupting. When DeWitt finished, Bumpy was quiet for a moment. "Who told Curtis to ask that question?" he said. DeWitt blinked. "What?" "Curtis. The question he asked about declining. Who told him to ask it?" DeWitt shook his head slowly. "Nobody told him. He's 23 years old, and he asked the most dangerous question of the morning," Bumpy said. "To a man who hasn't been told no yet." He paused. "Where is Curtis now?" "Home. I told him to stay home." "Good." Bumpy stood. "You did the right thing." It was the closest thing to praise DeWitt had heard from him in 3 years. Then came the harder conversation. James, nobody used his last name in rooms like this, had been with Bumpy since before Alcatraz, since before the federal cases and the years of institutional interruption and the long, slow process of reasserting a presence that the city had tried to file away permanently. James was not a man who required explanations. He was a man who required decisions. He came in late afternoon, when the light through the single window had gone the color of old copper. He sat down. He put both hands on the table. He looked at Bumpy directly. "They hit the church collection," he said. The room changed. Not dramatically. Not with noise. The way pressure changes in a room when something structural shifts, something that was holding, becomes something that isn't. Bumpy was very still. "Explain that," he said. "Reverend Thomas." His assistant was carrying last Sunday's collection to the deposit. 2 of Schultz's men stopped him on 115th, took 20%, said it was the new arrangement for everyone operating in the neighborhood. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. "The Reverend called it in himself," James said. "He didn't want to. I think he was embarrassed, but he called." Bumpy looked at the window. The light was almost gone. This was the moment his circle had been waiting for. They had watched him absorb the runners being taxed. They had watched him hold them back from responding to the corners being occupied. They had watched him listen and nod and send people home and maintain the quality of stillness that made him what he was, and they had understood. Intellectually. Why? The strategy of it. The discipline. But the church was different. The church on 115th Street was the one that received the envelope on the 1st of every month, the one that stayed heated through winter because of that envelope, the one that Bumpy had never claimed publicly, never attached his name to, never used as demonstration of anything. It was the one thing he did that was purely for the neighborhood, not for leverage, not for loyalty, not for any return, for the neighborhood. And Schultz's men had taxed it, not because they knew what it meant, because they didn't, because Harlem to them was a territory to be administered, and everything in a territory being administered is subject to the same percentage. That was the insult inside the insult. They hadn't targeted the church. They hadn't known enough to. They had just applied the logic of acquisition to everything in front of them and happened to include, in their systematic coverage, the one thing that revealed exactly how little they understood about where they were. James watched Bumpy's face. Bumpy's face told him nothing and everything. "What do you want to do?" James said. It was the first time in 3 days anyone had asked him directly. Bumpy stood, picked up his hat, set it at the precise angle. "I want you to find out which 2 men stopped the Reverend's assistant," he said. "I want their names. I want to know where they're sleeping. I want to know what time they wake up." He moved toward the door, and James, "Yeah, don't touch them yet." He walked out. The cold received him. That night, for the first time since November 6th, the corners near 116th were quiet, not empty. Quiet. The men who were usually there were somewhere else. Not visibly mobilized. Not obviously preparing. Simply absent from the corners in a way that Schultz's men, if they were paying the right kind of attention, might have found more concerning than any visible activity. Absence, in Harlem, had its own vocabulary. Most people who hadn't grown up in it couldn't read the language. Schultz's men hadn't grown up in it. 2 miles south, in a building off Amsterdam Avenue, a phone rang at 11:15 p.m. Dutch Schultz's man, the one who coordinated the operation, who had designed the rhythm that was now 3 days into its installation, picked it up. The voice on the other end gave him a brief update. Everything proceeding. Collections underway. Minor resistance from some of the runners. Nothing significant. The church collection had been a slight improvisation from the assigned territory, but it had gone smoothly. He thanked the voice and hung up. He poured himself a drink. He thought about the operation, the way a craftsman thinks about a thing he's built, with the satisfaction of someone who has done this before and knows the shape of what comes next. He did not think about the quiet corners on 116th. He should have. Bumpy had held his people back for 3 days. 3 days of watching. 3 days of absorbing. 3 days of building a picture so complete that when the time came, nothing would be improvised and nothing would be wasted. The cost of that restraint was visible only to the people closest to him, and even they didn't know the full weight of it. Not yet. November 10th, 1947. 4 days in. The operation had settled into itself, the way Schultz's operations always settled, not with the dramatic declaration of conquest, but with the quiet, administrative certainty of something that had already decided it was permanent. The corners were staffed. The collections were running. The percentage was being paid by enough runners that the ones who hadn't paid yet were beginning to feel the particular social pressure of being the exception to a rule that was rapidly becoming the only rule. That was how it worked. Not through universal force. Through sufficient compliance. Get enough people paying, and the ones who aren't paying start to feel like the problem. Schultz had used this mechanism in the Bronx, in pieces of Brooklyn, in the fringes of neighborhoods that had more institutional protection than Harlem, and had still, eventually, adjusted. He was 3 days from considering this one adjusted. Bumpy knew this. He had watched the mechanism work in other places. He understood its timeline the way a doctor understands the progression of something he has seen before, not with detachment, but with the particular urgency of someone who knows exactly how much time there is before the window closes. The window was closing. Not dramatically, by degrees. The same degrees the runners had been losing ground by since the first morning. Each degree small enough to rationalize. The accumulation impossible to rationalize once you could see it clearly. He could see it clearly. He had given his circle the space to bring him information for 4 days. He had listened. He had held them back. He had absorbed their frustration with the same quality of stillness that the neighborhood absorbed everything, not passively, but structurally, the way a building absorbs wind, not by yielding, by standing, but buildings have load limits. And on the morning of November 10th, the load arrived. 7:45 a.m., corner of 118th and Lenox. Her name was Della, 44 years old. Had lived on 118th Street since 1929, had raised 3 children in a 2-room apartment, and had done it without asking anyone for anything she didn't earn, which in Harlem in the 1930s was a statement of character that carried more weight than any credential the wider world recognized. She ran a small beauty shop out of the ground floor of her building, not affiliated with the numbers, not part of any operation. She cut hair. She pressed hair, she listened to the women of the neighborhood talk about their lives, and she kept what she heard with the discretion of someone who understood that the things people tell their hairdresser are told in the expectation of confidence. She was not a political figure. She was not a community leader in any formal sense. She was simply a woman who had been on 118th Street for 18 years and who, in the way of people who stay in one place long enough, had become part of the neighborhood structure. At 7:45 a.m., 2 of Schultz's men stopped her on the corner. The specific details of what happened in the next 4 minutes were reported to Bumpy by 2 separate people who witnessed it from different angles and whose accounts, when assembled, produced a picture that was clear in its facts and deliberately restrained in its interpretation. The men stopped her. They told her the beauty shop was now subject to the same arrangement as the other businesses on the block, 20% of weekly revenue, the same terms as everyone else. Della told them the beauty shop was not part of the numbers and not part of any arrangement, and she didn't know what they were talking about. The taller man, the one who worked the east side of Lenox, the same one who had been on the corner since the first morning, reached past her and pushed the door of her shop open. He looked inside. He looked back at her. "Looks like a business to me," he said. He said it without aggression, without particular malice. The way a man says something when he's not angry, when he's simply processing the world through a framework that has no category for the specific human being in front of him. He let the door close. He wrote a figure on a piece of paper. He held it out to her. Della did not take it. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She said nothing. After a moment, he set the piece of paper on the ground in front of her feet. Then both men walked back to their corner. Della stood there for a moment, looking at the piece of paper on the ground. She didn't pick it up. She went inside. She sat down in the first chair. She didn't open for business that morning. The woman who witnessed this from across the street went directly to the restaurant on 116th. She didn't knock. She stood outside. A man came out within 3 minutes, listened to her, went back inside. 6 minutes after that, another man came out and walked north toward 118th at a pace that was not hurried but was not casual. He was back within 20 minutes. Bumpy was sitting with James when the man came back. The man reported what he'd seen, what he'd confirmed, what Della had told him when he'd knocked on her door. Bumpy listened. He asked one question. "Is she all right?" "She's all right." "Shaken?" "She's all right." Bumpy nodded. The man left. Bumpy and James sat in the room. The single bulb overhead. The cold coming through the gap at the bottom of the door. James had known Bumpy long enough to know the difference between his silences. There was the silence that meant he was still gathering information. The silence that meant he was constructing the picture. The silence that meant he was holding something back that he wasn't ready to release. This was none of those. This was a different silence. The silence of a decision that had already been made, not in the last 6 minutes, not even in the last 4 days, but in some deeper part of him where the calculations that governed how far he would allow something to go had been running since the first morning and had now produced their output. James recognized it. He had seen it twice before in 11 years. Both times, things had changed. "When?" James said. Bumpy looked at him. 2 days, he said. "Why 2 days?" "Because I want the information I asked for." He paused. "And because I want them comfortable." James understood. A man who has been operating for 4 days without consequence becomes a certain kind of comfortable. The comfort that comes from the absence of resistance. The comfort that makes a man stop checking the things he should be checking. That stops him reading the room with the vigilance that the early days of an operation require. 2 more days of no consequence. 2 more days of the rhythm proceeding as planned. 2 more days of Dutch Schultz's man in the building off Amsterdam Avenue pouring his evening drink with the satisfaction of a craftsman watching something he built function correct. 2 days. That afternoon, Bumpy did something nobody expected. He walked 116th Street end to end. Not with escort. Not with the 3 men who usually fell into step behind him, at a respectful distance. Alone, at the pace of a man who has nowhere to be, which everyone on the block understood meant he was exactly where he intended to be. He stopped at the barber shop on 117th, went inside, sat in the chair, got a haircut from a man who had been cutting his hair since 1939 and who asked no questions and kept his eyes on the work the way professionals keep their eyes on the work when the work is the only conversation required. When it was done, Bumpy looked in the mirror for a moment. He left a tip that was larger than the cut. He walked out. He stopped at the church on 115th. Not for long. 5 minutes. He sat in the 3rd pew from the back, not his usual place, but Roosevelt's. The old man who had been running his small book since before some of these buildings were standing. The man who had bent down, slowly, and picked up every piece of the torn slip and put them in his coat pocket. Bumpy sat in Roosevelt's pew for 5 minutes. Nobody else was in the church. He didn't pray. He wasn't a man who performed prayer for an audience, and there was no audience. He just sat. In Roosevelt's pew. In the church that stayed heated because of an envelope on the first of every month. In the building that Schultz's men had decided, without knowing anything about it, was subject to 20%. He left the church and walked south. He stopped outside Della's shop. The lights were off. The door was locked. The piece of paper that had been left on the ground was gone, whether she'd eventually picked it up or the wind had taken it. Nobody knew. He stood outside for a moment. He didn't go in. He looked at the dark window. Then he turned and walked back toward 116th. That evening, he made 2 phone calls. The first call lasted 4 minutes. The second call lasted less than 2. Nobody who wasn't in the room for those calls knew their content. The men he called were not men who discussed their conversations with people who weren't part of them. What is known from what happened 2 days later is that both calls produced action. Quiet action. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already complete. The night of November 10th was cold and clear. On the corners near 116th, the men who were usually there were still absent. Had been since the 8th. The corners had a different quality now, not the warm absence of men who had somewhere better to be, but the deliberate absence of men who had been asked to be somewhere specific. Schultz's operation continued through the 10th and the 11th without interruption. The rhythm held. The collections ran. The man off Amsterdam Avenue made his evening call, received his update, and poured his drink. On the 11th, he noted in passing that the Harlem operation was running cleaner than the Bronx had run at the same stage. Less friction, faster compliance. He expressed this observation to the man on the other end of the phone with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose professional assessment of the situation was being confirmed by events. He did not note the empty corners. He did not note the specific absence of 3 particular men who had been visible on 116th every day for the previous decade. He did not note that the neighborhood, which had been murmuring with the ordinary noise of daily life for the first 4 days of the operation, had gone slightly quieter on the 10th and had stayed quiet on the 11th. He poured his drink. He had done this before. He knew what came next. He was right that he knew what came next. He was wrong about what shape it would take. There is a moment in every situation that has gone too far, when the person who has gone too far passes a threshold they can't see from the inside. They can only see it from the outside, and only after. Schultz's man thought he was 3 days from completion. He was 18 hours from a lesson he would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate to people who hadn't been in Harlem to receive it firsthand. Della's door. That was the moment. Not the church collection, not the torn slip. Della's door. A woman who had nothing to do with any of it, pushed open and looked inside, like what was in there was already his. November 12th, 1947. The city woke up the way it always woke up. Garbage trucks on Amsterdam Avenue. The smell of something frying 3 floors above a building on 117th. A radio playing through a window someone hadn't closed all the way. The particular sound of a city that doesn't pause for anything, not grief, not weather, not the specific weight of what is about to happen on one of its blocks. The city didn't know. The block knew. 4:50 a.m. The kind of dark that isn't quite night anymore but hasn't committed to morning. The sky over Harlem, the color of old iron, cold enough that breath was visible. Brief. Gone. On 116th Street, nothing moved. Not the absence of the previous nights, the deliberate, managed absence of men who had been placed somewhere specific. This was different. This was the stillness that precedes something the way certain animals go quiet before a storm. Not fear, recognition. The block knew the way. Blocks know things not through information, not through announcement, but through the accumulated instinct of people who have lived close enough together, long enough to read the air the way sailors read the water. Something was happening tonight. Something that had been decided 4 days ago and prepared for 2 days ago and was now, in the last hour before the city's first light, arriving at its conclusion. Bumpy had been awake since 2. Not from anxiety. Anxiety implies uncertainty, and there was no uncertainty left in this. The decision had been made on the 10th. The preparation had been completed on the 11th. What remained was execution. And execution, for a man of Bumpy's particular discipline, was the least complicated part of any operation. It was the deciding that cost. He had dressed in the dark, the same way he dressed every morning methodically, without haste, each item in its place, his hat last, set at the precise angle. He had stood at the window of his apartment for a moment, looking at the street below. He could see his breath on the glass. He turned and walked out. James was waiting in the hallway, not with the energy of a man anticipating action, with the stillness of a man who had been given a specific thing to do and had organized himself around doing it correctly. They didn't speak in the hallway. They walked down the stairs together. Outside, the cold received them. 4 men were on the street, not clustered together, positioned the way pieces are positioned, each one at a specific coordinate that Bumpy had specified the previous evening with the precision of a man who had been thinking about the geometry of this for longer than anyone realized. He looked at each of them once. He nodded. They moved. What happened between 5 a.m. and 6:15 a.m. on November 12th, 1947, has never been fully documented in any official record. This is not accidental. The people who were there didn't talk to investigators. The investigators who might have been interested were operating within a system that had its own arrangements with certain parties, and those arrangements created specific blind spots that, on this particular morning, turned out to be large enough to accommodate everything that occurred. What is known through the accounts of people who were on those blocks that morning, who saw what they saw and carried it in the way you carry things that are too significant to share casually and too important to forget, is this. 12 men had come into Harlem. By 6:15 a.m., 11 of them were gone. Gone is a specific word. It requires specificity, not dead. This needs to be stated clearly, because the story has been told in ways that reach for the dramatic conclusion, that reach past the truth towards something more cinematic than what actually happened. Not dead. Gone in the way that men are gone when they have been removed from a place with sufficient clarity about what removal means, that returning is not a calculation they are willing to make. Gone in the way that leaves no ambiguity about the nature of the message. Gone in the way that Bumpy had always preferred, when preference was available, because dead men create investigations, create attention, create the machinery of official response that costs more than it resolves. Gone men create silence. And silence, in this case, was the point. The 11 were found, those who were found in various states of the same condition, intact, unharmed in any way that would be visible to a doctor or a court or a newspaper, but carrying something in their faces and their posture that people who saw them in the hours afterward described consistently with the same word: diminished, not physically, something else. The quality that men carry when they have encountered something they were not prepared for and have had to recalibrate, fundamentally, their understanding of where they stand in relation to the world. They left Harlem. All 11 of them. Some that day. Some over the following 48 hours. None of them came back. None of them explained, to anyone who subsequently reported it, exactly what had happened. The silence was its own testimony. The 12th man was different. His name doesn't matter for the purposes of this story. What matters is his function. He was the coordinator, not the man off Amsterdam Avenue who made the evening calls and poured the drinks, but the operational coordinator, the man on the ground who had designed the rhythm, who had assigned the corners, who had written the percentages on the pieces of paper and handed them to men, who handed them to runners and beauty shop owners, and a 71-year-old man named Roosevelt. He was the one who had known what came next. He was the one who had been wrong about the shape of it. Bumpy found him at 6 a.m. in the restaurant on 117th that the man had been using as his base of operations for the previous 6 days. Not on 116th. He'd been smart enough to know that 116th was Bumpy's address, that establishing himself there would have been a provocation too direct to manage. He'd chosen 117th, 1 block north, close enough to demonstrate presence, far enough to maintain technical deniability. The restaurant was empty, except for him. He was sitting at a table near the back. Not because he'd retreated there, because that was where he'd been sitting every morning for 6 days, reviewing his notes, organizing his day, beginning the rhythm that had been running without interruption since November 8th. He had a cup of coffee. He had his notes. He had the particular composure of a man who has been doing this long enough to have stopped thinking of it as dangerous. When Bumpy walked in, the man looked up. He looked at Bumpy. He looked at James, who had come in behind Bumpy and positioned himself near the door with the specific quality of stillness that communicated everything that needed to be communicated about the nature of the morning without a word being spoken. The man looked back at Bumpy. He did not reach for anything. He was smart enough for that. Bumpy sat down across from him. He set his hat on the table. He looked at the man's coffee cup. He looked at the notes. He looked at the man's face with the quality of attention that people who had been on the receiving end of it described as the most uncomfortable experience of their lives, not because it was hostile, but because it was complete. There was nothing performed in it. No anger, no menace, no theatrical display of dominance. Just a man looking at another man and seeing all the way through him. The coordinator held his composure. He was a professional. He had been in rooms with dangerous men before. He understood, on a technical level, that composure in these moments was not just dignity, it was information management. A man who loses composure tells you things. A man who holds it gives you less to work with. He held it for about 45 seconds. Then, something in Bumpy's stillness, something in the specific quality of his patience, the sense that he had all the time that existed and intended to use exactly as much of it as the situation required, began to work on the coordinator in a way that composure training doesn't prepare you for. Because composure training assumes the other person is also managing something. Bumpy wasn't managing anything. He had already arrived at the end of this and was simply waiting for the coordinator to catch up. "You know who I am," Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. The coordinator said nothing. "You've been here 6 days, Bumpy said. You did your homework. You knew the runners. You knew the blocks. You knew the collection points." He paused. "You knew my name." Silence. "So you know this was always going to end here," Bumpy said. "In this room, with you looking at me across this table." The coordinator's composure held. "Barely. What I want to know," Bumpy said, "is whether you understood what you walked into, whether Schultz told you, or whether he sent you up here the way he sends men places, knowing what he knows, and keeping the relevant parts to himself." Something moved across the coordinator's face. It was brief, involuntary, the kind of expression that happens before the composure can catch it. Bumpy saw it. He nodded slowly. "He didn't tell you," Bumpy said, not with satisfaction, with something closer to acknowledgement. "He sent 12 men into Harlem, and he didn't tell you what Harlem was." The micropause. The moment before the climax line where everything slows to the speed of a held breath. The cold coming through the front door of the restaurant. The coffee cooling in the cup between them. The sound of James near the door, breathing. The sound of the city outside, beginning its morning, indifferent to what was happening in this room. The coordinator looked at Bumpy. For the first time since Bumpy had sat down, the coordinator looked at him without composure. He looked at him the way a man looks at something when he finally understands what he's looking at. Bumpy leaned forward, just slightly, the way a man leans when he wants to make sure the thing he's about to say lands in the exact place he's aiming. "You're going to walk out of here," he said. "You're going to walk south. You're going to walk all the way back to wherever Dutch Schultz is sitting right now, comfortable, waiting for his next update." He let that sit for 1 second. "And you're going to tell him exactly what you found up here." Another second. "Tell him Harlem isn't the Bronx." He held the man's eyes. "Tell him we don't get administered." The coordinator left the restaurant at 6:17 a.m. He walked south on Lenox Avenue. Nobody stopped him. Nobody followed him. Nobody marked his exit with anything. No gesture, no word, no acknowledgement of what had just occurred in the restaurant on 117th Street. He simply walked, alone, south, through a neighborhood that watched him go the way. It watched everything from windows, from doorways, from the corners where men had begun to reappear as the first light came over the buildings. He walked the full length of Lenox without looking back. He crossed 110th Street. He kept walking. On 116th, the woman with the coffee cart was back on her corner for the first time since November 4th. She had her cart out by 5:30, the way she always did. She was pouring coffee when she saw the man walk south past her corner. She watched him until he was gone. She didn't say anything. She poured another coffee for the man who had been standing at her cart for the last minute and a half, waiting. The man took the coffee. He looked in the direction the other man had walked. "He's gone?" the man said. "He's gone," she said. The man nodded. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. At 6:45 a.m., Bumpy was back on 116th Street. He was carrying his book. He walked at the pace of a man, with nowhere urgent to be. The block had begun its morning. The sound of doors opening, the smell of coffee and cold air, the particular rhythm of a neighborhood reassembling itself after something it will never fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. He stopped at the corner. He looked north, then south. He opened the book. He read 2 lines. Then he folded it under his arm and walked on. The 12 men Dutch Schultz sent into Harlem, 11 gone before the morning was over, 1 sent back, intact, walking south, carrying a message that had only 4 words in it. But those 4 words contained everything. Everything Schultz had failed to account for. Everything Harlem had always known about itself. We don't get administered. 4 words. The whole story. The coordinator crossed 110th Street at 6:23 a.m. He didn't stop walking until he reached the building off Amsterdam Avenue, where the operation had been managed for the previous 6 days. The building where the evening calls had been made, and the drinks had been poured, and the professional satisfaction of a well-running operation had been noted and catalogued and reported upward through the chain of men who reported to Dutch Schultz. He went upstairs. He knocked on the door. He delivered his report. What happened in that room in the next 20 minutes has no surviving witness account precise enough to reconstruct completely. What is known is what Dutch Schultz did not do next. He did not send more men. He did not call the police. He had that capacity through the arrangements that kept precincts looking in specific directions, and he did not use it. He did not contact his political connections, the men in the machinery of city government who had smoothed his operations in other neighborhoods and who could, theoretically, have applied pressure from angles that the street couldn't defend against. He did none of these things. He was quiet. For a man who had built an empire on the specific grammar of overwhelming response on the principle that any resistance, however small, had to be met with force disproportionate enough to make the memory of resistance more costly than compliance, the quiet was the most significant thing he could have done. It was also the last thing anyone expected. To understand the quiet, you have to understand what the coordinator told him. Not just the facts of the morning, 11 men gone, 1 sent back, the restaurant on 117th, the 4 words delivered across a cooling cup of coffee. Those were the facts. For a man like Schultz, were inputs. He processed facts the way an engineer processes stress calculations, not emotionally, but structurally. What does this mean for the load? What does this mean for the plan? What the coordinator told him that changed the calculation was not the facts. It was the quality of what he'd seen. The coordinator had been in rooms with dangerous men. He had sat across tables from men who wanted him dead and had maintained composure and had processed the situation and had found the angle that kept him functional. He was a professional. His value to Schultz was precisely his ability to remain analytical in conditions that dissolved other men. He sat across from Schultz and told him what he had seen in that restaurant on 117th Street. Not what Bumpy had said, what Bumpy had been, the stillness of him, the completeness of the attention, the absence of anything, performed no anger, no threat, no display. Just a man who had already arrived at the end of the situation and was waiting with infinite patience for the situation to catch up to where he already was. The coordinator had been in rooms with dangerous men. He had not been in a room with that. Schultz listened. He poured a drink. He didn't offer one to the coordinator. He sat with the information for a long time. November 12th, 1947, 9:30 a.m. 3 miles south of Harlem, in a building that had nothing on its door either, 3 men sat in a room and discussed what had happened. Schultz was one of them. The other 2 were men whose names appeared in certain ledgers and certain court documents of the period, but whose specific involvement in this specific morning is not part of the record. What is part of the record in the way that things become part of the record in Harlem, through the accumulated testimony of people who were adjacent to events and carried their knowledge, the way oral traditions carry knowledge, carefully, specifically, across decades, is the shape of the decision that came out of that room. No escalation. The Harlem operation was suspended. Not publicly, not with announcement, not with any communication to Bumpy Johnson or anyone in his circle. Simply suspended the way you suspend something when the cost-benefit calculation has shifted enough that continuation no longer makes sense. The corners went empty that afternoon. The collection stopped. The rhythm that had been installed with such professional precision over 4 days was simply switched off. The way you switch off something that is drawing more current than the circuit can handle. This is the part of the story that gets misread. People hear that Schultz backed down and they reach for the explanation that fits the narrative they already have, that Bumpy was more powerful, more feared, more dangerous, and Schultz, recognizing superior force, retreated. That's not what happened. Or rather, that's not all of what happened. Dutch Schultz was not a man who backed down from superior force. His entire history argued against it. He had faced men more physically formidable than anything Harlem had produced and had not backed down. He had faced legal pressure, federal attention, the organized hostility of other criminal enterprises, and had not backed down. What he backed down from, on November 12th, 1947, was something different. He backed down from a situation he couldn't read. And Schultz, whatever his flaws, and they were substantial and well documented, was intelligent enough to know that the situations you can't read are the ones that kill you, not through direct confrontation. Through the accumulation of miscalculations that direct confrontation, once begun, makes inevitable. He had sent 12 men into a neighborhood he understood as territory. He had received back 1 man and 4 words. The 4 words told him what the 12 men hadn't been able to tell him going in. This was not territory. This was something else, something with its own internal logic, its own weight, its own history of surviving things that should have destroyed it, something that had a man at its center who was not going to be administered. Schultz could escalate. He had the resources. He had the connections. He had the mechanism. What he didn't have, what the coordinator's face had told him he didn't have, was the certainty that escalation would produce the outcome escalation was supposed to produce. And uncertainty, for a man whose entire operation was built on the reliable prediction of how resistance behaved when met with sufficient force, was more dangerous than any specific threat. He chose the quiet. By noon on November 12th, the last of Schultz's visible presence above 110th Street was gone, not dramatically. The corners simply had different people on them, or no people. The restaurant on 117th went back to being a restaurant. The blocks that had been staffed for 6 days went back to their ordinary configurations. The numbers runners resumed their routes. Full routes. Uninterrupted. At the same time, they had always run them, on the same blocks, with the same slips, in the same rhythm that had nothing to do with Schultz's rhythm and everything to do with the rhythm of a neighborhood that had been operating this way since before he'd looked north. Curtis, the 23-year-old who had asked the most dangerous question of the morning on November 8th, was back on his corner by 1 p.m. He didn't know exactly what had happened. He didn't need to. He could feel the difference in the block, the way you feel the difference in a room after a window has been opened. Roosevelt was back on his corner by 10 a.m., 71 years old, coat pocket still carrying the pieces of the torn slip which he had never discarded. He had carried them for 6 days as a specific reminder of something specific that he intended to carry until the situation resolved itself one way or the other. He stood on his corner. He looked at the block. He reached into his coat pocket. He took out the pieces of the torn slip and looked at them for a moment. Then he let them go. The wind took them south. He watched them until they were gone. Then he turned back to his corner and began his morning the way he had begun his morning for 30 years. Della opened her shop at noon. She had kept it closed for 2 days. Not from fear, from a specific, personal decision to not open a door she hadn't been ready to open under the circumstances that had existed when it was last closed. The circumstances had changed. She opened the door. She turned on the lights. She put water on. By 1:30, she had her first customer. She didn't talk about what had happened. She was not a woman who processed difficulty publicly. She cut hair and listened, and kept what she heard with the confidence her customers had always trusted her with. At some point in the afternoon, she later said she didn't remember exactly when, only that the light had changed, gone from the flat gray of midday to the warmer angle of late afternoon. She looked up from her work and out the window. The street looked the way it always looked. She went back to work. 2 miles south, in the building off Amsterdam Avenue, the man who had coordinated the operation was packing. Not quickly, not with panic, with the methodical efficiency of a man who has been in situations that required relocation before and has developed, through repetition, a system that eliminates wasted motion. He had been told to relocate. He had been told nothing else. He packed his notes. He packed the ledger with the 20% figures. He packed the pieces of paper on which he had written the names of the runners and the blocks and the collection points with the careful specificity of someone who had done their homework. He packed all of it. At the door, he paused. He looked back at the room, the table where the evening calls had been made, the glass that still held the residue of the last drink he'd poured with the satisfaction of a craftsman watching something he'd built function correctly. He looked at the room for a moment. Then he walked out. He did not look north. Dutch Schultz would be dead within 8 years. Not from Harlem. From the same machinery of violence and acquisition that he had applied to everything he'd touched turned, eventually, on him by the men who had decided he was more dangerous as an enemy than useful as an ally. The Harlem operation was never discussed in the accounts of his rise and fall. It was a week in November that ended quietly. No bodies. No investigation, no newspaper, just a neighborhood that went back to its rhythm, and a man who had spent 4 days deciding how far was too far, and had been right about where the line was. Harlem did not celebrate. That was the first thing. In the days that followed November 12th, there were no gatherings, no declarations, no public acknowledgement of what had happened on those corners and in that restaurant on 117th Street. No speeches, no announcements, no moment where the neighborhood turned to itself and said, "We did this, and here is what it means." That was not how Harlem processed things. That was not how Bumpy processed things. Celebration implies surprise. And the neighborhood, at its deepest level in the part of it that had been carrying the weight of its own survival for longer than any single story could contain, had not been surprised. It had been confirmed. There is a difference. November 13th, 1947, morning. The block returned to itself the way water returns to level after something has disturbed it. Not immediately. There is always a period of adjustment, of small oscillations, of the surface finding its new relationship with stillness. But the return is inevitable when the thing that disturbed it is gone. By the second morning after, the coffee cart was back. The barber shop opened at its usual time. The runners ran their routes. The church on 115th received its Wednesday morning congregation smaller than Sunday, always smaller, but present with the particular quality of people who come, not because it is required, but because the building means something to them that they can't fully articulate and don't need to. The Reverend said nothing from the pulpit about the previous week. He didn't need to. The building was heated. What the neighborhood did, instead of celebrating, was remember, not loudly, not collectively, in the specific, distributed way that communities carry important things person to person, in specific rooms, at specific moments, passed along with the care of something that loses something essential if it's handled carelessly. The barber shop on 117th was where some of it lived. Not in any organized sense, the barber was not a historian and did not present himself as one. But the chair in his shop had been occupied by a specific quality of conversation for 30 years, and the conversations of that week settled into the shop's atmosphere the way smoke settles into fabric, present without being visible, released in layers when the right conditions existed. A man would come in, get in the chair. The barber would work, and at some point, not immediately, not artificially, but when the conversation arrived there, the way conversations in barbershops arrive at the things that matter the week of November 6th through 12th would surface, always in the same way. Not as a story about violence, not as a story about power, as a story about what didn't happen. This was the thing that people remembered most, in the specific way that the most important things get remembered, not the 11 men gone before morning, not the coordinator walking south on Lenox Avenue alone, not the 4 words delivered across a cooling cup of coffee in a restaurant on 117th Street. What they remembered was what Bumpy had not done. He had not moved on the first day. When 12 men crossed 110th Street before dawn, he had been awake before them, and aware before them, and ahead of them in his thinking before any of them had taken their first corner, and he had done nothing. He had not moved on the second day, or the third, or the fourth. He had listened. He had held his people back. He had absorbed the collections and the corners and the church and Della's door with a quality of patience that the people closest to him described, in the years that followed, as the most frightening thing they had ever witnessed. More frightening than any act of violence. Because violence you can categorize. You can file it. You can understand its shape and predict its aftermath. What Bumpy had done for 4 days had no shape that fear could grasp. It was the patience of a man who was not waiting for permission, who was not waiting for the situation to become bad enough to justify action, who was simply precisely building something complete enough that when it moved, nothing would need to be revisited. James talked about it once in 11 years, in a specific room, to a specific person, under circumstances that made the telling feel necessary rather than voluntary. He said that the hardest part of those 4 days was not the restraint itself. It was watching Bumpy carry it. You have to understand, James said. Every one of those men who came to him, Marcus, DeWitt, all of them, they came because they trusted him, because they believed that if they brought it to him, he would know what to do with it. That was the arrangement. That was what the whole thing was built on. He paused, and he took every piece of it, every single piece, and he held it, and he didn't let any of it show. Not to them, not to anyone. Another pause. But I was in that room every day, and I could see what it cost. He didn't elaborate on what it cost. He didn't need to. The person he was telling it to understood. The woman with the coffee cart had her own version. She had been on that corner since 1938. She had watched the neighborhood change and hold and change again. She had watched men come through who thought they understood 116th Street and had watched the street educate them, one way or another, in what it actually was. She had watched Bumpy Johnson walk past her corner more times than she could count. She said to her daughter, to a neighbor, to anyone who asked her directly about that week in November, that the thing she remembered was the morning of the 12th, the coordinator walking south. Alone. She had watched him go the way she watched everything from her corner completely, without expression, storing it in the place where she stored the things that mattered. He looked smaller, she said. Not frightened. Just smaller. Like something had been taken out of him. She thought about it. Not taken out of him, she corrected herself. Put into him, like he'd been given something to carry that he hadn't been carrying before. She meant the knowledge. The specific knowledge of where he had been, and what he had found there, and what those 4 words meant in the context of everything that had happened in the preceding 6 days. The knowledge of what Harlem was. He was carrying it south. Whether he'd be able to explain it to Schultz was another question. Whether Schultz would be able to hear it was another question still. Bumpy was seen 3 times in the week that followed, once at the restaurant on 116th, once at the church on 115th briefly, the same 5 minutes, the same 3rd pew from the back, and once on the corner of Lenox and 116th on the evening of November 15th, standing with his book under his arm, watching the block. Nobody approached him directly about what had happened. Nobody asked him to explain it, or describe it, or confirm the version they had assembled from what they'd heard and seen. They didn't need to ask. He didn't need to answer. The block was back to its rhythm. The runners were running. Della's lights were on. Roosevelt was on his corner. The church was heated. That was the answer. Not in words. In the state of the neighborhood. The Reverend, on the Sunday following the 12th, gave a sermon that made no reference to the previous week. He preached from Isaiah, the specific passage about those who wait upon the Lord renewing their strength, about mounting up with wings as eagles, about running and not being weary, about walking and not fainting. The congregation sat with it. Nobody in that building who had lived through the previous week heard it as a sermon about patience in the abstract. They heard it as a description of something specific, something they had watched from corners and windows and barbershop chairs, something they had been part of in the way communities are part of things not through direct action, but through the accumulated weight of their presence, their trust, their willingness to let a man carry what he had agreed to carry. The Reverend finished. He looked out at the congregation. He said nothing else about it. He sat down. Weeks passed. December came. Then January of 1948. The cold deepened, and the block adapted to it, the way the block always adapted, with the particular resilience of people who have never had the luxury of being fragile. The story of the 12 men moved through Harlem, the way the important stories moved carefully, selectively, in rooms where the people present had earned their presence through years of demonstrated discretion. It was not told as a boast, not told as evidence of Bumpy's power in the way that power is usually demonstrated loudly, publicly, with the specific intention of deterring future challenge. It was told as something else, as a reminder of what the neighborhood was, of what it had survived, of the specific quality of the man who had stood between it and the thing that had come for it, not with volume, not with spectacle, but with 4 days of silence followed by 1 morning of irreversible clarity. There are things that neighborhoods carry that never make it into records, not because they're hidden, because the language that records use can't hold them accurately. What happened in November of 1947 on 116th Street was one of those things. It lived in the barbershop, in the coffee cart, in the 3rd pew from the back, in the pieces of a torn slip that the wind took south on a cold morning, in the specific way that men on corners stopped talking when Bumpy walked past, not from fear, from the weight of what they knew. And what they knew was this: when the thing came for the neighborhood had not been alone. Years pass the way, years pass in neighborhoods like Harlem, not cleanly, not in the straight line that history books prefer, where one thing ends and another begins with the clarity of a chapter break. They pass in layers, in the accumulation of winters and summers and elections and funerals and children born into buildings their grandparents had already been born into, in the slow replacement of faces on corners while the corners themselves remain, absorbing everything, giving back nothing except the particular quality of their continued existence. 116th Street was still 116th Street. The coffee cart was still on the corner. The barber shop was still on 117th. The church on 115th was still heated. Dutch Schultz was shot on October 23, 1935, Newark, New Jersey. The Palace, Chop House, a contracted killing ordered by the National Crime Syndicate, the very organization whose rules and arrangements Schultz had repeatedly violated, whose patience he had exhausted through a combination of recklessness and the particular arrogance of a man who had won too many times in the same way. He died the following day, October 24, 1935. He was 33 years old. In the hours between the shooting and his death, delirious and attended by a police stenographer who recorded everything he said in the hope that the dying confession would produce something useful, Schultz spoke in the fractured, disconnected language of a man whose mind was coming apart at its seams. He spoke about his mother, about money, about men he had known and men he had crossed, and the specific, churning arithmetic of a life built on force, meeting its own force at the end. He did not mention Harlem. He did not say the name 116th Street. He did not say the 4 words. In 2 hours of recorded dying speech, the neighborhood that had sent his coordinator walking south alone on a cold November morning did not surface once. Whether this was because Harlem had genuinely receded from whatever remained of his consciousness by then, or whether it was because the memory of it carried a specific quality that even a dying man's fractured mind preferred not to revisit that question, has no answer. What it has is a silence. And by now, in this story, you know what silence means. Bumpy Johnson lived for 21 more years after November of 1947. They were not easy years. They were not the years of a man who had won a significant confrontation and been permitted by the universe to collect his winnings in peace. The machinery of federal prosecution that had been pointed at him since the 1930s continued to turn, slowly, with the particular patience of institutions that have more time than the people they're pursuing. Alcatraz, 9 years. He was 49 years old when the federal system finally produced a conviction serious enough to send him to an island in San Francisco Bay that had been specifically designed to hold men the prison system had decided were too significant to be held anywhere accessible. Alcatraz was not punishment in the ordinary sense. It was removal, the deliberate extraction of a man from the context that made him what he was, placed somewhere where context was not available and could not be constructed. They were wrong about what that would do to him. Not wrong that it was hard. It was hard in ways he did not discuss, and that the people who knew him could only estimate from the quality of his silences when the subject came close. But wrong that removal from Harlem would diminish what Harlem had made him. You can take a man out of a neighborhood. The neighborhood does not come out of the man. He came back in 1963. 63 years old, 9 years older than when he'd left, which sounds like arithmetic and is actually something else, entirely 9 years of a specific kind of institutional time that ages a man in ways that have nothing to do with the calendar. He walked back into Harlem. Nobody organized a reception. Nobody arranged a gathering. Nobody put up a sign or made an announcement or performed, in any public register, the acknowledgement of his return. The block simply made way, the way it always had, the way it had been making way since before most of the people currently standing on it had been born. He walked down 116th at the pace of a man with nowhere urgent to be. He stopped at the barber shop on 117th. He got in the chair. The barber, not the same man from 1947, his son now, who had grown up watching Bumpy walk past the shop window and had inherited both the business and the discretion that running it required, cut his hair without asking questions. When it was done, Bumpy looked in the mirror. He left a tip larger than the cut. He walked out. The years between 1963 and 1968 are the years that people who loved Harlem and loved what Bumpy represented find the most difficult to talk about, not because of what Bumpy did, because of what the world did around him. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21st at the Audubon Ballroom on 166th Street, shot 16 times in front of his family, in a neighborhood that had known him, in a building that had been built for other purposes and was being used that afternoon for the purpose of ending one of the most important voices the community had produced. Bumpy said nothing publicly. This was noted. Bumpy Johnson, who had an opinion about everything and expressed those opinions to the specific people in the specific rooms where his opinions were sought, said nothing publicly about the assassination of Malcolm X. The people who knew him said he was never the same after, not visibly, not in ways that changed how he carried himself, or how the block received him, or how the work of maintaining what needed to be maintained proceeded, but in the specific quality of his silences, which the people closest to him had learned to read the way the woman with the coffee cart read the block completely. Without expression, something had changed. Something that had been present in him since Charleston, South Carolina, since arriving in Harlem as a child, since the Depression and the riots and the federal cases and Alcatraz and the 9 years away and the return, something that had survived all of that, had come through all of that intact, had walked back onto 116th Street in 1963 and found the block still making way. That something was tired, not broken, not gone. Tired, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has begun to feel, not the weight of it, but the duration. June 7th, 1968, Wells Restaurant, West 116th Street. He was 62 years old. He was at a card game with friends, not enemies, not rivals, not the machinery of confrontation that had defined so many of the significant moments of his life. Friends, men he had known for decades, men who knew which floorboards creaked. He collapsed at the table. Heart failure. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. The last words of Ellsworth, Raymond Johnson Bumpy, to everyone who knew him, which was everyone, are disputed, unrecorded, debated still, in specific rooms, by people who were adjacent to the moment and whose accounts, assembled, produce several versions that are each plausible and none of which can be confirmed. Some say he said nothing, that he was simply there and then not there, the way certain presences end completely, without diminishment, one moment fully present and the next fully gone. Some say he said the name of someone at the table, a friend, an acknowledgement of presence. Some say he said something about the street, about 116th, about the neighborhood that had made him and received him and watched him walk its length more times than anyone had counted. None of these accounts can be verified. All of them feel true. What Harlem remembered in the years that followed was not the disputes. It was the duration. Not just the November of 1947, not just the 12 men and the one who walked back, not just the 4 words delivered across a cooling cup of coffee to a man who carried them south and spent the rest of his professional life trying to explain what he had encountered in that restaurant on 117th Street. All of it, the whole span of it. The boy from Charleston who had arrived in Harlem and decided, at some point in the accumulating weight of what he observed and what he absorbed and what he refused to accept, that this neighborhood was worth the specific cost of standing between it and the things that came for it. The man who read Langston Hughes and settled debts that courts couldn't touch. The man who walked 116th alone during the riots because the neighborhood was burning and leaving felt like a betrayal. The man who put an envelope under the reverend's door on the 1st of every month and never claimed it publicly. The man who sat in Roosevelt's pew for 5 minutes on a cold November morning in a church with no congregation before making 2 phone calls that he never discussed. The man who held his people back for 4 days when every instinct in that circle was pushing for immediate action. Who understood that the difference between a response and a strategy was patience. who built something complete enough that when it moved, nothing needed to be revisited. The man who looked at another man across a cooling cup of coffee and said 4 words that contained the entire history of a neighborhood that had survived everything pointed at it. We don't get administered. The barbershop on 117th is gone now. The restaurant on 116th with no name on the door is something else. The building that housed Della's shop was demolished in 1987. The church on 115th is still standing. The coffee cart corner is occupied by something different now, something that serves different people at different prices for different reasons, and the woman who stood there from 1938 onward has been gone for decades, but the corner is still there. 116th Street is still 116th Street. And in the specific rooms where the specific people who carry this story gather, the rooms that don't have names on their doors, that you find by knowing where to look, that receive you the way the neighborhood always received the people who belonged in it, the story is still told. Not as a boast, not as evidence of anything that needs to be proven, as a reminder of what the neighborhood was, of what it cost to keep it that way, of the man who paid most of that cost in the currency of patience and restraint, and the specific, exhausting discipline of someone who understood that the most powerful thing he could do for Harlem was not to take from it, but to hold for it, to stand between it and the thing that came, every time, for as long as he was standing. Some men leave buildings behind. Some men leave money, institutions, names on things. Bumpy Johnson left a neighborhood that knew the difference between a man who was gone and a man who was absent. He was never gone. Not from Alcatraz. Not from the card table on 116th Street. Not from the specific rooms where his story is still told in the specific way it deserves to be told. Carefully, with the weight of what it cost, without embellishment, the way Harlem carries everything that matters. If you want to understand why, you already know what to do.